The atmosphere inside the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 on October 13, 1972, was electric. 45 souls were aboard, most of them members of Montevideo's Old Christians rugby team, their friends and family, flying to a match in Chile. They were young, vibrant, and filled with the kind of boundless confidence only youth can offer. They'd made a stopover in Mendoza, Argentina, to wait out bad weather over the Andes. Now they were on the final leg. Inside, 24-year-old Nando Parrado was talking, full of life, about his passion for racing cars. Near him, Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, was immersed in a textbook, his mind already fixed on the complex mechanics of the human body. Life for all of them was an open road. The pilot, Colonel Parrado, was attempting a dangerous shortcut through the treacherous mountain pass, relying on experience rather than precise navigation in the clouds. Suddenly the smooth flight was over. The plane slammed into violent turbulence. The sky outside was a dizzying blur of gray and white. The aircraft dropped violently, throwing passengers against the ceiling. Then came the sound no one ever forgets, the shattering alarm of metal protesting a force too great. "We're too low," someone screamed. The tail section of the plane was sheared off by a peak, taking with it 3 rows of seats, the bathroom and the galley. The remaining fuselage, now a toboggan of screaming people and luggage, shot through the valley, hitting the ground not once but twice. The final impact, a horrifying, tearing screech, was the nose of the plane plunging deep into a snowbank. The world stopped. In the wreckage of the fuselage, 29 people were still alive, but barely. Bodies were trapped under twisted metal. The air was a mixture of aviation fuel, blood, and the metallic cold of raw survival. For Nando Parrado, the initial silence was everything. He had survived the impact, but his head injuries were so severe he slipped into a coma. Beside him, his mother, badly injured, lay silent. His beloved sister, Susanna, was also alive but gravely wounded. Roberto Canessa, the medical student, was awake. He was surrounded by the horrifying evidence of human fragility. Fractured limbs, open wounds, shattered ribs. His medical training kicked in, overriding the shock. He worked in the dim light, tying off bleeding limbs with strips of clothing, setting splints, and whispering reassurances into the panicked night. They were stranded, high in the Andes, at 11,700 feet, in the wreckage of an airplane. The temperature, even inside the torn fuselage, was already dropping below freezing. The first night was brutal. The wounded cried out in pain, their voices swallowed by the endless mountain wind. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly, covering the wreckage and burying the dead. The temperature plunged too. Canessa and others worked tirelessly to secure the fuselage. They used luggage and pieces of insulation to seal the gaping hole where the tail had been, trying to create a tiny, airtight sanctuary. They used the seat cushions for bedding. Every movement was an effort in the thin air, a battle against exhaustion and hypothermia. By morning, 4 more had died from their injuries, including the co-pilot. Elias, a young man who had been the life of the party just hours before, was gone. Nando Parrado was still comatose. His father, also on the trip, had been killed instantly in the initial impact. His mother, Eugenia, died that first morning, her last breath a silent sigh. Nando would not wake for 3 days, spared the initial horrors and the devastating loss. When he finally did open his eyes, the world was a blinding white coffin. The remaining 27 survivors took a grim inventory. Food, a few chocolate bars, some wine, jars of jam, peanuts, and half a dozen bottles of liqueur, the only things that survived the crash. They pooled it all, and the elder survivors, like Roy Harley, took charge of rationing. Each person received a tiny, agonizing sliver of chocolate per day. The search. They were certain the search teams would find them quickly. The plane was missing, the route was known. They held on to that hope like a physical shield. They listened, straining their ears for the faint sound of a propeller. But as the days bled into each other, the hope began to curdle into despair. They found a small transistor radio among the luggage. On the 8th day, they huddled together to hear the report. The speaker's voice was tinny, but the words were clear. After searching more than 30,000 square miles of the Andes, the search for the Uruguayan Fairchild is officially suspended. The blow was catastrophic. They were no longer accident victims waiting for rescue. They were prisoners of the snow, forgotten by the world. They were, in the brutal calculus of the mountains, already dead. After the news, despair was not an option. It was a luxury they couldn't afford. The survivors found a grim resolve. They would have to save themselves. The realization brought a new, immediate problem: starvation. The meager rations were gone by day 10. They tried to eat pieces of leather from the seats, even cotton from the cushions, but their bodies, desperate for calories, rejected the indigestible material. The air was thinning not just due to altitude but due to the biological reality of zero fuel. Their bodies were beginning to consume themselves, muscle tissue, fat stores, turning them into walking skeletons. On the 10th day, Canessa, the medical student, gathered a small group of the strongest men, Nando, Parrado, Fito Strauch, and Daniel Fernandez, for a grim, quiet conference. "We are dying," Canessa stated simply, his voice cracking from thirst and hunger. "If we don't find a source of protein and energy, we have perhaps 4 more days before the weakest among us perish." The eyes of the men dropped to the floor of the fuselage. The floor where, under a blanket of snow, lay the bodies of their friends. The silence that followed was heavier than the plane crash itself. This was the true moment of impact, the collision between civilization and absolute, prehistoric survival. Parrado finally spoke, his eyes empty. "We can't survive on hope. We can't survive on leather." Fito Strauch, a logical, quiet engineering student, took a slow, agonizing breath. "The human body is meat. It is protein. Every religious and social custom forbids it, but biologically, it's the only way we can generate the energy to climb out of here." The decision, known as the Pact, was perhaps the single most difficult moment in the history of modern survival. They were not just choosing to live, they were choosing to consume the dead to do so. They swore a pact. If any of them died, the others would use their bodies to survive. Canessa, the reluctant doctor, made the first cut. Sound. Silence, then a small, dry, metallic rasping sound. A moment of intense, dry heaving. The initial revulsion was total. Some survivors fled the fuselage, vomiting the small amounts of water they had left. The act violated every moral, spiritual, and social law they had ever known. Yet, as the hunger pains receded, replaced by the warmth of necessary, life-giving protein, a terrible clarity set in. They were not committing a crime, they were embracing a sacrament of survival. They were making a sacrifice, the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice, for the possibility of life. The grim sustenance bought them days, then weeks. They had survived starvation. Now they battled nature. On the 17th day, a terrifying sound tore through the high valley. A deep, seismic roar. The avalanche. A massive wave of snow slammed into the fuselage, collapsing the roof and burying the survivors inside their aluminum shell. The crushing weight of the snow felt like the entire mountain was trying to finish the job the crash had started. 7 more were killed instantly, crushed or suffocated, including one of the pilots and the older survivor, Javier Methal. The remaining 19 were now trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin, struggling to breathe in the dark. Canessa, Parrado, and others fought for hours in the blinding snow to dig a tiny air hole to the surface. This second disaster, however, had a strange, paradoxical effect. The avalanche stripped away the remaining comfort and complacency. It brought them closer to death, but it also crystallized their purpose. There was no more waiting. There was no more hope of an air search. They had to walk out. The great plan began to take shape. They needed to find the tail section of the plane, which they believed contained the radio battery and a working antenna. If they could get the radio working, they could call for help. After a grueling expedition, Fito Strauch and his cousin found the tail section, miles down the valley. They found clothes, cigarettes, and, most importantly, the batteries. But their hope was instantly dashed. The radio, even with the new batteries, was fried. It was useless. There was only one option left. The one no one wanted to admit. By day 60, the group was down to 16. They had survived the crash, starvation, and the avalanche. Now they faced the final test. They were high on the eastern side of the Andes, meaning the vast, inhabited plains of Chile lay hundreds of miles to the west. But they couldn't be sure which direction was which. The strongest man, Nando Parrado, volunteered to lead the final, desperate march. With him went Roberto Canessa, the reluctant medical student, and Antonio Vizintin. They were given the most food, strips of frozen human flesh. They were given the warmest clothing and the promise of the others' unending will. They were to walk until they found salvation or died trying. On December 12, 1972, 61 days after the crash, the 3 men set off. The walk was a nightmare of endurance. They had no map, only a relentless belief that the lush valleys of Chile were just over the next ridge. They climbed a massive mountain, a 3-day agonizing ascent in the thin air, pushing their bodies beyond all known limits. When they reached the summit of what Parrado would later call the Mountain of Doubt, Nando saw a sight that nearly broke him. Not the green valleys of Chile, but an endless churning sea of white peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. They were still deep in the heart of the Andes. He looked at Canessa, expecting to see defeat. But Nando had spent his weeks healing not just his body but his spirit. He looked west and he made a single, unbreakable decision. "If I must die," Nando told Canessa, "I will die walking. And I will die looking for my home." They sent Vizintin back to the plain, knowing that 3 men needed too much of the precious, life-giving food. Parrado and Canessa pressed on, 2 men alone against the world. They walked for 10 more days. They crossed glaciers, skirted cliffs, and descended into lower valleys. Their skin was burned by the sun and wind. Their boots were shredded. They were so weak they often had to stop and rest, waiting for the food to turn into energy. Finally, on the 10th day of their trek they saw a miracle: green. Not just moss or scrub but a patch of grass. And then a small, flowing river. They were below the snow line. As they followed the river they found small signs of life. A cow print, a tiny stream of smoke in the distance. And then, on the banks of a river, a man on horseback. The Chilean cattle herder, Sergio Catalan, thought they were ragged mountain hermits. He couldn't hear their weak, desperate calls over the noise of the rushing river. Nando, in a stroke of genius, tied a note around a rock and threw it across the river. "We are from the plane that crashed in the mountains. We are 14 people alive. We need medical help. We can't walk anymore. Please." Catalan read the note, his face draining of color. He rode for hours to alert the authorities. The greatest story in modern survival had just reached the world. 2 days later, on December 22, 1972, the Chilean Air Force, guided by Parrado, reached the location of the fuselage. The surviving 14 people, starving, skeletal but alive, emerged from the wreckage and into the blinding light of their salvation. The 15 survivors, Nando, Canessa, and the others, were flown out. But the questions, the ethical dilemmas, and the horrifying truth of their survival followed them down the mountain. The world called it a miracle. The survivors called it a choice. The story of the Andes survivors immediately dominated global headlines. But when the truth of how they survived was revealed, the decision to engage in anthropophagy, the reaction was immediate and polarized. Reporters, politicians, and religious leaders debated their ethics. Had they become monsters? The survivors, led by Parrado and Canessa, faced the world with courage and honesty. They held a press conference where they explained, with solemn dignity, the impossible decision they had made. Canessa, the medical student, summed up the moral complexity best. "The moment we took that step, it was like a covenant. We were using the bodies as sustenance, not as people. We had to break the ultimate taboo to save the life that was left." They spoke of the dead with love and respect, describing the act as a desperate agreement, a final, generous gift from those who died so that others might live. In the end, the world's judgment softened. It was not a tale of depravity, but an unprecedented story of human will. The human spirit, when pushed beyond all boundaries, is capable of breaking every law, even the law of survival itself, to achieve the ultimate goal, to return home. The 16 survivors of the Andes tragedy, the 16 who came back, stood as a testament not to the darkness of the human heart, but to its fierce, unyielding, and terrifying capacity for life. They were a reminder that sometimes, the greatest moral choice is the choice to keep breathing. The miracle of the Andes is more than a survival story, it's a profound look into the impossible choices that define humanity. The 72 days spent in that white hell became the ultimate test of faith, morality, and resilience. What would you have done? Would you have been able to make that choice? If this story of human endurance against the ultimate odds moved you, hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of true strength. The men who walked off that mountain didn't just survive, they redefined what it means to live. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because next time, we'll dive into another story where the human will is the only thing standing between life and absolute oblivion.